Policy Lessons from South Korea's Development. Korean Development in the East Asian Context with Dwight Perkins.
I'm Dwight Perkins. I'm a professor at Harvard University, and I've spent much of my life studying the economies of East Asia, and particularly the economy of the Republic of Korea, or South Korea. And I'm going to talk today about the nature of Korea's growth over the last 50 or so years. When you see Korea today, it seems a natural process that the economy would have started and continued to grow naturally right up to the current state of a modern industrial urban economy. But if you looked at Korea in the 1950s and 60s, you would have had a very different impression. The country had been destroyed by war. The city of Seoul was mostly rubble because it had been fought over 4 separate times during the Korean War. The U.S. foreign aid was critical to rebuilding the city and rebuilding the infrastructure that existed prior to the war. But the feeling in the late 1950s and even at the beginning of the 1960s was that the Korean economy was known really, frankly, as a basket case. It was going to be dependent indefinitely on foreign aid. It had no real independent ability to develop on its own. But the government that came to power in the military coup of the early 60s under General and then President Park Chung-hee wanted desperately to, one, become less dependent on foreign aid, and two, to basically become independent and a successful developing country. And then the question became, what were the choices that they faced? In many countries, you have natural resources, and you can export natural resources and then import the goods you need. But in Korea's case, they had no natural resources. What natural resources they had were in what had become North Korea when the country was divided at the 38th parallel. So there was no natural resource exports. They had agricultural exports, but Korea had had a thoroughgoing land reform, and that had led to a rise in income of the rural poor, the farmers, and they basically consumed the rice that had been exported to Japan. So rice exports largely disappeared. And then the question is, what was left? And the answer was the only way that Korea was going to get any exports was to export manufacturers. But in the 50s, there was no prospect of exporting manufacturers because the government had maintained a overvalued exchange rate, largely because it basically thought it was dependent on foreign aid and the payments by the UN military forces. And the way to get the most dollars out of the UN military forces was to keep the exchange rate overvalued. But that killed exports of all kinds. So Korea in the late 1950s had essentially no exports. It had $50 million, which is essentially nothing. But then the government, though, decided that they were going to fundamentally change, and they set out to change the strategy and to promote manufactured exports. That may seem like an obvious choice, and I just made it seem like an obvious choice because they really had no other choice. But at the time, most economists were saying that, you couldn't really build economic growth on the basis of export of manufacturers. It was going to be too difficult. The markets were going to be hard to penetrate, and so on. That, of course, proved to be absolutely wrong. But the government set out to promote exports, and they created all kinds of subsidies for exporters. A simple example was for those exporting textiles, they were able to use the limited foreign exchange available to import cotton, but they were allowed to import more cotton than they really needed for the exports. The exports were sold very cheaply abroad. It's textile exports made from the cotton. But then the remaining cotton that was left over could be used to produce for the domestic market. And the domestic market in that time was highly protected. That is, this was not just a liberal trade regime that was introduced. It was, in fact, a trade regime that was that promoted exports and very tightly restricted imports, and gave actually monopolies to some Korean companies over certain markets in order to encourage them to develop. And in that context, but the subsidies worked. And in the 60s, the exports of manufacturers began to grow. Now, if Korea had done the same strategy in the 1920s and 30s, it frankly wouldn't have worked, because the world economy in that time was closed to foreign trade. Most countries during the immediately after World War I and during the Great Depression had closed their markets. But after the war, the U.S. economy in particular was completely open. The U.S. had low tariff barriers. It welcomed the exports from countries that were able to export manufacturers to it. And frankly, the U.S. was not bothered by the fact that the Koreans tightly restricted imports. The goal for the U.S. at the time was to make sure that Korea succeeded in economic development, so it would become less dependent on aid. And in fact, that's what happened. The exports began growing rapidly. The gross domestic product of Korea began growing rapidly, in fact, at unprecedented rates. Japan had experienced something earlier, somewhat like that. But for Korea was the first truly developing country to grow at that kind of rate, as was along with Taiwan, that did much the same thing. The Korean approach to industrialization was not the same as that of many other countries. There was a high level of government intervention. I've already mentioned the export subsidies. When you get to the 1970s and the development of heavy industry, the government even went further. It developed infrastructure for those industries. It actually had the government decide which industries were going to be promoted. And then it gave enormous advantages in the form of cheap credit and even a monopoly of the local markets to the heavy industry, to the companies that were developing these heavy industries. This was the heavy and chemical industry drive, and it made possible the transition in Korea to a economy no longer completely dependent on labor-intensive goods and increasingly producing machinery and steel and shipbuilding and so on. And tight restrictions on imports of these goods continued in this early period. This approach that, with all this government intervention, was central to creating what were called large conglomerates or large chaebol in Korean. And these chaebol, the government, however, was different from many other governments in that it was rigorous about supporting chaebol when they performed well and rigorous about cutting them off when they performed badly. There was almost no politics in the decision-making as to which industries would be supported, and there was nothing that economists would call rent-seeking or corruption in those decisions. There was corruption in Korea, but it was not allowed to interfere in any way with the industrial development strategy. The question then becomes, how was it that Korea was able to promote such a policy when, frankly, many, many other countries have not been able to do so? And I think a lot of the answer, part of the answer is that Park Chung-hee, the president, was not interested in financial gain for himself, as unlike many other leaders in countries that have corrupt leadership of one sort or another. But it was also the case that the Korean leadership knew that if they did not perform well, if the economy did not perform well, it was quite possible that the Republic of Korea would cease to exist. That is, North Korea at that time was seen as doing well. South Korea would be swallowed up if it was a failure economically. So that was critical to most economies when they have a high level of corruption in government, or the government doesn't have the technical skills to carry out an industrial policy. The right answer, frankly, is to rely almost entirely on the market. The Koreans relied on the market, but to a much lesser degree. There was a much stronger government intervention in this earlier period. As the economy got more complex, the government began to withdraw, and the country increasingly relied on market forces. And as you move away from the authoritarian period of the Park Chung-hee years and then the Chun Doo-hwan years of the early 80s, you move to democracy. The issues of corruption and rent-seeking in politics begin to creep into industrial policy, but by then the government is moving away from a highly interventionist approach and relying more and more on market forces, where the government really is not involved, and hence corruption and politics play a lesser role. Another key feature of the environment that Korea faced was that it had a dynamic economy right next door, namely Japan. But during the 1950s, all trade with Japan had been cut off, largely for political reasons by the Korean government of that time, largely anti-colonial feelings that led to that. During the mid-1960s, the Park Chung-hee government opened up trade with Japan, and without that, the development of the economy of the Republic of Korea would have been much, much more difficult, because there was a close economic relationship between Japan and Korea historically. Getting rid of the barriers to that trade was essential. It was politically very unpopular. There were riots in the streets, but it was essential to the success that occurred. The question about this Korean experience is whether this is a policy that other countries could follow. And I think the answer is the export-led strategy is probably still viable, although much more difficult today because there are many more competitors, and particularly for competitors trying to enter into the manufactured export market, you now have the particularly large competition from China that Korea and Taiwan did not have. That said, there have been other changes as well. For example, Korea could pursue a policy that restricted imports while promoting exports. For countries starting out today, that is a much more difficult policy. The World Trade Organization rules make it very difficult to have tight restrictions on imports, give monopolies on the domestic market to local firms and things like that. To get ahead today, countries like Vietnam that have started out much later have had to liberalize imports to a much greater degree than was the case in Korea. And the other big issue that I think faces anybody who's thinking about carrying out these policies is whether they can keep politics and corruption out of the decision-making process. If they can't, then I think the Korean approach, interventionist approach of the early years in Korea, makes very little sense. The later Korean experience with much more market-oriented development, or the experience that you find in Hong Kong, in Singapore, where they relied mainly on the market, that kind of strategy makes much more sense because that largely eliminates much of the corruption from the process. Korea today faces a fundamentally different situation from what it faced even 10 or 20 years ago. They now are competing with the most advanced countries in the world. And on the whole, Korea has prepared itself well to do that. The key element in that has been the development of the education system. Korea has one of the most fully developed university-level systems, and the proportion of the population that goes through university levels is extremely high, higher than that in most high-income countries. They've also begun to compete, have to compete in high technology. They particularly have been going toward green technology. This puts them in direct competition with China, that's just coming up and trying to compete in these areas on the one hand, and with the United States and Europe and Japan on the other. But Korea has laid the foundation that makes it possible for it to continue to compete in this way as its income continues to rise and as growth continues. Growth, of course, is no longer growing at 8 or 9% a year. Countries at this level have to make their own mistakes. They can't just copy what went ahead of them. Korea is now forging ahead on its own innovations and growing. It's growing steadily and probably will continue to grow steadily for quite some time into the future, largely because it has laid the key foundations of a strong infrastructure and particularly a highly educated population.